Greetings, fellow time travellers. Well, once again, it's time to get ready to be charmed, challenged, and inspired by a brilliant guest for another conversation. But before we venture into those waters, I want to give you a quick reminder to check out my patreon.com site. By signing up there, just look for me by name. By signing up, you give practical support to the channel, you get early access to all the content, and you get exclusive access to a really good portion, which is the question and answer session that Paul and I film together every week. Altogether, it's a great site, we think. So come and join, make it better by being there. All right, let's get to that promised interview. Hi everyone, fellow travellers. This is an opportunity for another conversation with an interesting, if not inspirational figure. In this instance, it's Nick Hudson. Nick Hudson has become a friend of mine in that strange way that has been unfolding for a lot of us over the last few years, meeting unexpected people and finding a common chord. Nick is technically a private equity investor, a man of finance, a man of business. But I find these introductions to my interview guests increasingly difficult to do because the fact is, whatever they were in the world of before, the way in which I have been drawn into their orbits is because I'm not interested in what they do for a living. It's because we find a common bond in being equally confused about what's happened and equally determined to find paths leading out. So with that in mind, I think, I'll invite Nick Hudson just to maybe give us a hello, Nick. And, do you get what I mean by that? That it's not really about what we were before all this kicked off. It's about who we are now.
100%, Neil. And I totally echo your sentiments. You are one of a number of people I'm so grateful to have come across and who I'd never have come across absent this whole COVID phenomenon and then the process of intelligent and questioning minds trying to locate it, trying to understand why it happened and what the backdrop is, what the sort of the grandfather phenomena behind that whole thing are. And it's been a remarkable and stimulating few years, very worrying few years, as you say. That's why we're all in this. But yes, it doesn't matter that I'm a private equity investor.
Technically, I'm an archaeologist. This is the ridiculousness of it. And I talk to oncologists, or I talk to teachers, or I talk to electricians and plasterers, people from all walks of life. And it's not about any of those things. It's about the fact that what we all have in common is this sense that something somewhere has gone badly wrong. I do think it's probably of interest to my audience that perhaps don't know you as well as I do, to explain a little bit about PANDA. And that, the organisation of which you are chairman, because it interests me because in essence, it manifests what we're talking about, because you're all people from different walks of life got together in, was it 2020?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the formation of PANDA was one of those really strange elements of my life, I guess. I was preparing for my investor conference at the beginning of 2020. It was, that was in February 2020. And I thought, one of the things I should just scratch into is this whole emergent story of the big COVID scare. And so I started looking at it. And the more I scratched, the less I found of substance. And I actually reported to the investors on I think it was the 27th of February in 2020, that, look, this whole story is about a virus. The virus is inconsequential here, but the hysteria that's developing around it is something to watch. And that was in February. When this phenomenon of lockdown started emerging, I kind of went incandescent. I couldn't believe that such a stupid action would be taken in developed countries, let alone developing ones where there's no social safety net. And I basically found them morally and intellectually repulsive. And I was after a few days of dithering and fretting and bad sleep, a friend of mine said, you're not going to sleep well until you do something about this. And I began writing letters and, just emails to. I'm a fairly well-connected guy in South Africa because of my private equity history and so on, professional networks and so on. I started writing to CEOs and heads of NGOs that I knew, newspaper editors, those kinds of people. And I was shocked at how they just shut the door on me. This was very early on. We're talking in, March, early April of 2020. I just couldn't get traction with people. In many cases, these were people who I'd done favors for, people who owed me kind of some payback, and I couldn't even get them to talk to me. So I was a little bit taken aback by all of this. But in that process, a network of like-minded individuals began to distill, as I did find one or two people out there who were seeing it with exactly the sort of clear vision of a rampant and fairly propagandized hysteria that was threatening to destroy the very fabric of society. And that was the beginning of PANDA. We sat down and wrote down a report called Quantifying the Years of Life Lost to Lockdown, pointing out that lockdown would have public health consequences of all of its own, and that those public health consequences would in all likelihood dwarf any plausible impact of this purported virus. And that organization grew from strength to strength. We internationalized it at the end of the year when we realized that nothing in the policy prescriptions of our country was being determined locally. It was all coming from the outside. So we internationalized, and that's the story of PANDA.
Something I have shamelessly, I thought of yours that I have shamelessly taken almost as my own. I think it's so opposite that I almost feel tempted to pass it off as my own idea because it's so good. But Hudson's Razer, which is this heuristic that you coined, this idea that if you're looking at something that is presented as a global crisis, so-called, and that the only solution being offered for it is similarly global and top-down and centralised, and part 3 of Hudson's Razer, if all other offerings, all other suggestions, far less dissent is being stamped on, then, according to the Razer, you're dealing with a scam. And I have
Correct.
found that to be a sharp edge that cuts through a Gordian knot of choreographed complexity.
Yeah, I have to. I don't almost want to agree with you because it sounds a little bit arrogant, but I find it that way as well. When I realized that this is the 100% formula, whenever you're dealing with global crisis, admitting only global solutions, amid an environment of suppression of dissent, you are dealing with a scam definitively. And it applies to so many of the things that we see around us right now. Now, of course, having spotted the scam is only a small part of the journey. What to do about the scam is the harder part. But it is an important thing. And yeah, I've had some traction with people. When I work, I say to them, look, you tell me whether you can think of some other phenomena, not just COVID, climate crisis, water shortage, farting cows, whatever. Let's talk about this global crisis that's being held out to us, and tell me whether you can spot the imposition of only global solutions and the stamping out of any dissenting voices. And what does it mean when ideas are so weak that they can only be propelled in the world with the assistance of censorship of all sorts of dissent?
For the audience, obviously it's worth saying, you and I have talked at some length about everything, about the universe and everything that surrounds it. And I think the net effect of that has been that we don't really talk so much now about specifics like the scamdemic and the plandemic and so on, because it's become, those are just illusory in a sense. And we've been trying to get to the heart of the matter. And in thinking about us getting together today, a variation on thoughts was coming at me, and there's a famous quotation that's supposed to have come out of the Vietnam War, which is someone saying, "In order to save the village, we had to destroy the village," and it's close to a Sun Tzu line about the evil ruler will burn his nation to the ground just to rule over the ashes. And what I want to talk about in part today is that idea that are we looking at a coming to fruition of a long planned determination to bring down a system that worked to some extent, so as to replace it with something else that much better serves the intentions and the wants of those who are burning down nations in that way?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. To me, the existence of these taglines like "Build Back Better" all presuppose it presupposes that there has been some element of destruction, and I think this kind of convenient ability to point to, oh, it was this virus over here that did the destruction, not us. We had nothing to do with it, but we're going to build back better. I think that these contrivances are exactly that. They're attempts to paper over the deliberate nature of the destruction, the kind of decades-long planning for the events that bring down the spirit and integrity and energy of Western civilization, really.
And how do we find our way through that morass, that minefield, so as to not spin off into what are usually dismissed as conspiracy theories? And does your Razer or your sort of pragmatic, sort of button down determination to find simple solutions, or not simple solutions, but to see the problem, to strip away some of the applied complexity that's there to confuse? Is there a way that we can talk about this and point to where we think some of the problem, where all the roads lead, I suppose?
Yeah, and I think before we approach the way, I think it's worth just stopping and remembering that before you solve a problem, you want to characterize the problem properly. You want to make sure that you've described it correctly and that you're not making a scam of your own in your brain. That a little just so story for how the world works, and because that'll lead you to becoming the next Don Quixote, tilting at this one imaginary windmill in your mind. And so what I've found myself doing in the last year is I've been actually saying less, because I realize that this problem that we face is nuanced. And the structure that I'm using a lot to think about the nature of the beast is to ask the question, how much of this is emergent and how much of it is deliberately architected? And how might I begin to answer that question for myself? When you read these global framework documents, and they proliferate out of these organizations that are linked to the United Nations and the various kind of climate change initiatives and NGOs, the Quango network, the World Economic Forum, Bank of International Settlements, this whole very intricate web of organizations. When you read those frameworks, I think for a even vaguely sentient, intelligent person, it's just obvious. The words are just nonsense from beginning to end. There's this kind of weird overlapping, interlocking jargon that comes at you. But you can't approach those texts with any fear of ever losing the perception that they're just nonsense from beginning to end, that there isn't a shred of intellectual or ethical respectability to the philosophy, the logic, the content of those texts. And I ask myself the question, well, is that a perception in the minds of the authors of those texts? Or are they in the grip of a certain kind of madness? Are they hypnotized by some very bad ideas? I
I
think that's kind of the starting point.
I fight away from, 5 years ago I didn't think any of these thoughts that I have now, and I keep on trying to kick away from and swim back from, but from conclusions that I don't want to come to. But increasingly, it seems to me that there's an element of destruction for destruction's sake. And as I
Yes.
say, I keep trying to swim away from that because I can't imagine wanting to destroy just for the sake of destruction. But increasingly, I
Yeah.
do wonder. And again, this is where you start swimming into the sea that's infested with conspiracy theories, so called. And I'm not being dismissive or pejorative about conspiracy when I say that. But do you, subscribe to the notion that there is a group, a cabal, an elite cohort that's collaborating and cooperating in any way, or do you think that's just no, not at all?
No, I think it's probably more accurate to say that there are lots of elite cabals and always have been. I actually find it, it's to believe otherwise is patently ridiculous. History is one long story of elite cabals duking it out and manipulating populations and manipulating enemy populations and so on. This is just what history is, that story of the elite cabals. So I don't find it kind of, the work that the conspiracy theory label does is to actually end analysis of history, because it's all about the story of rulers and their machinations. You don't study France without studying Napoleon and his intrigues and plots and so on. So to me, yeah, it goes without saying that there are elite cabals and they manipulate populations, and it has always been thus. That's not the interesting part, though. For me, there's a cluster of ideas which we can call utopian collectivism. It's as a single sort of motivating principle. Utopian collectivism is one of the worst ideas in history, or it's probably the worst idea in history. It's been proven incorrect as a motivator, or at least incompatible with human flourishing, time and time again. And yet the idea persists. And there's always a kind of this time is different aspect to it. And in the current instantiation of this drift towards utopian collectivism, the this time is different component is now we have data. We've got, because of the internet of things and our data centers, we've got the data, and so that changes our ability to control things from the center. It's going to be better this time. Whereas, of course, history is littered by people who made similar claims that their levels of technology had enabled them to implement a program of utopian collectivism with beneficial results for humanity, when in fact there will never be such technology. It's incompatible with basic logic. So we know at a very detailed level where the utopian collectivism fallacy breaks down. We know why it breaks down. We know what its illogicalities consist of. But that just doesn't seem to stop the idea. And what collects around that set of ideas of collectivism is, well, you need to have a rationale for imposition, a rationale for control frameworks and for authoritarian clampdowns on really all aspects of human freedom. You can't achieve collectivism without that. And
See, I think it comes. I think paradoxically, although it's always pitched as being for the common good, it's always if you bear with me, we'll get to a better place. Whatever this collectivist utopia or whatever. But I think, ironically or paradoxically, it's actually driven by a fear of people. if not, and that's why I always keep coming back to this anti-human agenda. I think the levers of power are in the hands, and perhaps to some extent have always been in the hands of people who are motivated more than anything else by fear of other people. And their fear of other people manifests in, well, at the very least, we've got to get control of these creatures, because if we don't, they're going to hurt us. So there's something of the nub of the problem there for me, that we're dealing with anti-human agenda. And of course it's artificial intelligence and technology that's becoming our identifiable foe, because it's against the biological flesh and blood human being. People who prefer the company of machines and technology over their messy, wet flesh and blood humanity with all its flaws.
Yeah. I think there's a tendency, there's a certain species of thinker that's perhaps more dominant at certain points in the cycle of empire than in others. And that species of intellect thinks about the world in terms of, look, there are these problems, but there's no need for the problems. If only I could get these creatures to behave themselves and to do certain things, they would see how wonderful and beneficent this system that I have in mind is, and how well everybody would do, how beautiful the planet would be. And I think those people, what they suffer from is a failure to appreciate the consequences of complexity, and a delusion that they are able to control complex systems. And so it's a type of stupidity, because it's not intellectually difficult to understand that complexity at a point is irreducible, that all sorts of systems embed vast complexity, and that attempts to intervene in complex systems are riddled with downside in terms of unintended consequences, or second-order effects that were not predicted, and so on. And attempts to meddle with complex systems over history have generally been greeted with disaster. These are not difficult things to understand, but it's kind of, I think, a pathology of thinking that is uncomfortably prevalent. People who believe that their spreadsheet is the one to control the world.
I think there was even a literal example of exactly what you're talking about by those that thought that they could re-engineer the immune system of the human species.
Yeah.
I've heard various people describe the human immune system as a veritable Pacific Ocean of vastness and depth and complexity, upon which we have sort of paddled out onto the edge of the depth in our little dugout canoes. And yet some people in those little dugout canoes have thought, right, I understand enough about the Pacific Ocean to change it. Yeah. I'm going to change it at the fundamental levels, and that'll be better. And you're like, no, that's because you don't understand the nature of an ocean and the biosphere.
No, absolutely. I mean, at a very basic level, just this idea of injecting a concoction of substances into the deltoid muscle, anticipating an improvement in this finely tuned product of billions of years of evolution in the immune system is infantile. It's a totally stupid construct. Yeah, just from the start, in principle, it's a bad idea. And yet somehow we arrive at the point where saying as much is intellectually disrespectable. It's quite uncanny.
But obviously, I'm thinking about people like not only but Bill Gates, but people who don't have any seemingly demonstrable credentialed expertise in anything, but they have money. They've got their hands on inestimable wealth, and that confers upon them the ability and the power to do these things, like these stupid things, like try and reverse engineer the human immune system because they think they understand it when they don't. And so another of the fun, it always comes back to money. does it or does it not? I mean, these anti-human people also seem to be preoccupied at all times by controlling money, money supply, money creation. And that's another of the basic edifices of difficulty that we're up against.
Well, actually, there's a scam embedded in that as well, in the form of modern monetary theory. You know, it doesn't fulfill the three features of Hudson's Razer, because there's no purported problem, right? What it's doing, the work that modern monetary theory does, is to try and cloak the theft that's fundamentally embedded in the central banking system, in a sort of in decorous robes, you know, to try and disguise that theft. And I mean, you find if you stand up and start poking the holes in modern monetary theory, and that's actually very easy to do because it's completely nonsensical, you will very quickly be piled upon by all sorts of bots and naysayers and deniers and so on, trying to just shout you down. They're not trying to reason against you, because reason is not possible in support of MMT propositions. And so there is this kind of very elaborate hoax called MMT that is projected very loudly, and it's not reaching the ears of the general public, because it's kind of macroeconomics is a rather sort of distant domain for most people. But it's very much current in the world of economics and at universities. This absolutely terrible set of ideas.
Is that? I mean, does it become again? It's a simplistic thing that I try to swim back from. But is that why we're in the mess we're in? I mean, does it all come back to the fact that this lie that has been being manipulated and exploited by those that, you know, understand it and know it for what it is and have got very wealthy off the back of it? Is it because that system is finally at breaking point, and everything else that's happening at the moment, scamdemics, war in Ukraine, Anthropocene climate crisis, and all of the rest of it, is all of that just to distract the attention of 8 billion people, while those that have benefited from money and its exploitation and that lie and that theft organize something else?
Yeah, organize another system for control and theft. I would say the latter. I think that's exactly what's going on. Is the very obvious psyops, the very obvious kind of distraction events that they just don't stack up. You're not sure exactly where the con is, but you know that at some level of the story, or its presentation, or its amplification, there's nonsense. There's a distractive device at work. We could see, I think most sensible people could see that was a big element of the Ukraine and Russian story. I think a lot of people find it harder to see that in the Israel-Gaza story. But even that sort of event that seemingly has been forgotten of just a few weeks ago, when supposedly somebody shot off Trump's ear, that whole event was just redolent of absolute screaming, craziness, nonsense at the level of kind of where you have to pinch yourself to and when you look around and see everybody taking this thing seriously,
Since you bring it up, how do you analyze that? I mean, we all watched it. I mean, it's that those moments were absolutely, they were so effective. I mean, there's no denying that Trump, in his 70s, going down, and then moments later coming back up with blood, punching the air and saying "fight, fight, fight." I mean, Joe Rogan said in his podcast the other day, it was the most American thing I've ever seen in my life. And you think, that clearly was the effect of it. But what the hell was it really?
No, I know. All I know is that it was bullshit, right? There's at some level, there's a terrible manipulation going on, I can't quite work out whose manipulation and exactly where. But there was just the entire event. You go, oh really? You want me to believe that story? It's just there's a skepticism at a level where you look at it and say, okay, so far the narratives that I've been getting do not stack up. Whether it's whether it's a narrative from the so-called left or the so-called right, the stories don't stack up. I'm sorry, but it's not just incompetence. I'm sorry, but it's not just dereliction of duty. I'm sorry, but it's not a plot of a single shooter to come and take out the American president. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. None of these stories make sense. To me, this idea that there's a kind of power structure out there that needs Donald Trump to go is a very questionable proposition. I mean, Donald Trump sat there appointing swamp creatures left, right, and center who went on to enable the entire COVID phenomenon, in the form of Alex Azar, who then went on to appoint Fauci and Birx. And that was one of the first moves that Trump made. This idea that Trump was just conned or misled by his advisors into making those appointments is complete and obvious nonsense. Trump may be stupid, but he's not that stupid. And so you look at this and say, no, actually, I don't think they care whether Kamala Harris or Donald Trump wins, because they're all puppets, people who will simply, comply with all the important features of this sort of globalist trajectory.
So, another aspect of it, I'm so glad you led us into this particular arena, because another thing that troubles me, and I can't unpick it, certainly not on my own. We're invited to think that Putin is at war with Zelensky, and that by proxy Putin is at war, or Russia's at war with America, and there's China doing its thing, and there's Iran doing its thing, and so on and so on. And yet, even a cursory examination of another perspective leads you to the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, all the central banks, the Bank of the Russian Federation, Xi Jinping's bank, all roads lead to the Bank for International Settlement that sits in splendid neutrality in untouched Switzerland. Now,
yeah.
if there was any truth really in the idea that Putin's Russia was at war with Biden's America, wouldn't he go off on his own with all these resources and all these, all the wealth of Russia, and set up the Bank of Vladimir Putin and do his own thing? But no, they take instruction. They all take instruction from the same central point, and you think, explain that to me. How does that work if they're at war with each other, but they're all getting the same email from the same source?
Yeah, and I think an important sort of question to ask in that, because I agree with you, all the roads lead back to the Bank of International Settlements and to the the families who control the central banks of the world. But I think the important question to ask is, okay, so when you say that the state has this power, how many states do you think there are who are actually able to take independent decisions? I can look at America and say, yeah, I can imagine America can take an independent decision. I can say Russia, I can say China, maybe Iran, maybe North Korea, But for the most part, the countries of the world, I don't believe, are run by governments that are actually independent. They're manipulated to a large degree from forces outside the country. And we saw that in the form of funding arrangements during the COVID story that were conditional on taking certain actions with respect to various policy responses to the COVID hoax. And
so do you think when you say that, you think, well, maybe America, well, maybe North Korea, maybe somewhere on the planet there's an independent state that can do its own thing. Let's say, but I'm always drawn back, because I'm interested in history, perhaps more than by anything else. I think that before there were states, nation states, there were landed estates. That were, before England was really England as a nation state, it was a king's estate. Likewise, France was a French family's estate. And that, for the longest time, it was just all these competing families, trying to enlarge or empower their estates. And the relatively recent, the very recent illusory presence of these nation states, you might be a bit of a red herring altogether.
Yeah, it could be at a level. If America, for example, is independent in the sense that as a country, it's able to take independent decisions. That's not saying that the mechanism of decision making that's presented to the public is indeed what's in play. Because, and this construct of the deep state or of a bureaucratic hegemony, I think is an accurate one at some level. And then you ask the question, well, how are decisions made in that power structure, in that hierarchy? Where, is it competing elites duking it out and agreeing on some matters and finding a sort of negotiated sort of muddle through that then results in the policy trajectories of America? Or is there some much cleaner sort of hierarchical structure in place that we are unable to see? Those are the kinds of questions which I find myself asking.
And is there a higher hierarchical structure that we're unable to see? I know you can't see it, but what does your hunch tell you?
Look, when I see I remind myself a lot of the power of ideas, including the power of bad ideas. And we mentioned one, utopian collectivism. It's an astonishingly bad idea, and yet it persists. Bad ideas can really be devils. They can spread like viruses. And you can, when you go back, it's very interesting to go back through those framework agreements that I was talking about earlier and to trace backwards from, let's say the Kyoto Accord to the 1971 Club of Rome document, where they begin to talk about using invisible threats to control populations. And in that document, they propose pathogens, deadly pathogens, and climate problem. At that point, they hadn't come. They were actually talking about global cooling. That was the threat that they were going to use to cause populations to cower in fear and accept impositions from central authority. So these ideas go back, and it's not just to 1971. They go back and back and back and back, and before you know it, you're reading something written in the 1930s that has the faint whiff of Cecil John Rhodes, Lord Milner, something to do with Rockefeller and Rothschild. They have this genealogy, and I think to an extent I can believe the third or fourth or 10th generation of these significant, powerful families, that they may have fallen for their own bull. It's possible that these bad ideas have actually got them convinced. But I rather am inclined towards thinking that at some level they know that those framework agreements and so on are the various policy documents and websites are empty, that they're vacuous, that this is just a fig leaf.
It's been suggested to me that you've invoked Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner, so let's go there. That it's been suggested to me that in their hubris and in perhaps their vanity or their intellectual pride, you always have these people that they think they can make the world right in their own image or whatever. And maybe they can and maybe they can't, but the fact is they're condemned to 70 and then they're gone. And if their plans are to be pursued, they pass it on like a sort of an inherited an inherited problem. But the people that inherit it are not them. Maybe don't have their hubris, maybe don't have their intellect or whatever. And eventually, by the 10th iteration, the 10th photocopy, you've just got people that are going through the motions. They're not committed to it. It's not their idea. They just inherited it. And I do want, it's been suggested to me that people at the moment, that whoever has inherited these bad ideas, these genetic malformations, that in fact, we or others might have to save them from themselves at the same time as saving everybody else from the catastrophic consequences. Because Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner, they couldn't predict the internet and didn't, or anything else. So they've passed on a bad idea that might even have been a bad idea at the turn of the 20th century, but by now it's a horrendously anachronous idea. And actually, it's not just about saving us. We probably regard ourselves as the goodies, but we're going to have to save the baddies from themselves.
Wonderful. Yeah. So the way I like to think about that, there's a phenomenon in psychology called post hoc rationalization. This observation that humans take actions and then explain to themselves after the fact why they took the actions. They justify them afterwards. So there's I
do that all the time.
Yeah. And it can be a very complex story. Like you might never be able to actually understand why you did something. There was a complex set of intuitions and motives, some of which are, you're conscious of, others of which you're not. And you take an action, and then afterwards you have to explain the action to your fellow human beings. And so you conduct this process of post hoc rationalization. And I think that kind of idea is useful when we're thinking about the mind of the great centralists, the Rhodeses and the Rockefellers and so on. When you're trying to understand their psychology, what is it? Their prime motive is control. They really believe that they would be able to design society, and they want to be in the position of, they love the power and the sort of this idea that they get together and chart the future history of the world. Now, in the process of sort of, if that's the prime motive, they're never going to admit that that's what this is about. So they begin to cloak it all in a language, a kind of epistemological framework, if you like, for that then disguises the underlying motive for power and control, cloaking it in this wonderful word salad. And that's where we enter this uncanny valley where words stop meaning what they originally meant, and where the sort of nugget of truth that is represented by an idea becomes horribly distorted. So I like to use the example, what is the sustainability construct, for example? That's the word. Oh, you must all do everything in a lovely, sustainable fashion. It's just so nice. It just rolls off the top. Of course you must be. Why would we do unsustainable things, Well, what is that doing? It's taking the basic construct of frugality, of not being wasteful and over-consuming or consuming, desiring things you can't afford. That kind of essential virtue, if you like, and it's over elaborating it. It's turning it into something far bigger. A rationale for limiting budgets and cutting off growth, a rationale for degrowth, a Malthusian proposition. It's not. It stops being about frugality and starts being about the much grander and more destructive theme. And as you sort of get the sense that this uncanny valley of terminology, these elaborate frameworks, are a kind of psychological form of post hoc rationalization that disguise the underlying objective that has been with us since the dawn of man, the objective for power and control.
What you're describing, what we're talking about, is this a good time for people like us to be alive? Are we witnessing something that's a necessary part of the sort of cyclical nature of the human experience and the evolution of the species? Are we privileged to be seeing what we are seeing, or are we just unlucky to be alive right now?
Well, I'm in love with life. Life is the most beautiful blonde I've ever seen. So I rather think that I am lucky to be alive. But I probably, would have felt I'd be lucky to be alive at any point in history. For me, the world is this amazing playground that stimulates my curiosity and I never wake up in a day and think, oh, I'd rather not be here, or I wish I'd been born at a different time. No, it's just another adventure in the playground, you know.
I suppose then what I mean, rather than, you know, what I mean is, do you think we're potentially on the cusp of seeing
Yeah.
your change for the
Yes, yeah.
better? You know,
Yeah.
do we have before us? I mean, obviously there are always multiple forks. You know, we could go in many different directions, but do we have before us, because of all this agony and uncertainty and, you know, the seemingly choreographed chaos, is it actually the opportunity to get to genuinely to get to something better?
Yeah, I share that. I do inhabit a world of that kind of optimism. I think we are beginning to. We're at a point where we are uniquely able to form networks that have the potential to generate significant knowledge in a domain that was probably characterized by very slow accretion of understanding in the past. So we're on hyperspeed right now, I believe, in understanding how control networks work. What the role, you mentioned the Bank of International Settlements. Well, understanding what that beast is doing is very difficult. You have to first have some insight into monetary theory, which is one of the most difficult things to understand, because it's at a level, it rests on psychological grounds, you know, that you trust the money that's in front of you. So you've got to understand the monetary system for starters, and then you need like a network of people who knows how the world works. People who have been inside the belly of the beast, who understand what goes on in the corridors of power at the investment banks and at the central banks and in the departments of the treasuries of countries and major corporations. You can't read a chapter in a textbook and walk away with sound understanding there. But when you can pool a network of people together and access the minds who have spent decades thinking about these problems, then you can learn very, very fast. And I think it would have been difficult to do that 30 years ago.
Yeah, I am very aware, and I count my blessings, so to speak, because what we're doing now and the reasons we are doing this. I mean, I would not have entered your orbit. We would not have met. Well, but we were brought together because we could be connected up by this amazing technology, and whatever was the catalyst for it. Over the last 4 years, I have had the privilege and the benefit of listening to really, really, really clever people.
Yeah.
I would never have been able to persuade those people. I would have known they were there, far less have been able to get into opportunities where I was able to just listen to them. We met on one of those Twitter space things, so called, you know, where someone else brought together, some people to talk. And but for that, I wouldn't know you. But in those Twitter spaces, which I've ended up taking, as you have as well, taking part in dozens of them, and you sit and you listen and you think, my God, this is one clever person after another that I'm having the opportunity just to be in the space of. And I've learned. I came through school, went to university. I've been to university 2 or 3 times. I've done all sorts of different things. But the education that I have had in the last 4 years, simply by having had the opportunity, courtesy of the internet and technology, to listen to people from disparate disciplines, I have learned. I've only properly been at school for 4 years, and it's been the last 4 years.
Yeah. I'm chuckling because I completely share that sentiment. But I think one of the characteristics that is profound in all of this, what the characteristic that such people share, is they're not hypnotized. You know, I have this feeling of walking around in a world where most of the people are under the grip of hypnosis. They believe their mental structure for reality is completely at odds with reality. You know, they believe a whole list of things that simply aren't true, and that feeling is kind of eerie and disturbing. And I've become used to living with it. It's very uncomfortable. at first when you you look around and you realize, oh, I'm in this meeting room I'm entering is full of people who simply do not have a grip on reality.
Do you
And
think
we've
it's
got
do you
to
think
have
it's do you think it's genetic? I wonder about that all the time. I remember, it's one of the things that really struck me when I was studying archaeology when that was my thing all the time, was coming to terms with the realization that at some point in the not too terribly distant past, there were probably about a dozen breeds of human, possibly alive all at the same time. Different. We're all golden Labradors or whatever. Everyone alive today is, so we're told. But there was a time when, there were Neanderthals still there, and there was, various other twists on the thread of what it is to be human. And so I often wonder, you talk about you're out there and there's all these hypnotized people. Do you think there's a genetic component to those that just found themselves not being affected by the Kool-Aid?
Yeah, I can easily, I can certainly tell myself a version of evolution where that kind of situation, a sort of a genetic predisposition to being hypnotized, is a logical thing to expect. And this is how I get to it. I imagine a world in which everybody thought critically and independently and challenged things and questioned the status of life, of hegemony, of hierarchy all the time. And I think in that world, it would be chaotic. I think we wouldn't be able to get things done. And so I wonder if human evolution hasn't embedded a kind of situation where, like, a high percentage, 80 or 90%, are people who are born with a gene complex that says, right, you're going to follow. You're going to go along to get along, and the mavericks, if you like, the independent thinkers, we've got to make sure that they're, this switch only gets turned on in 10% or 20%. Otherwise, we have chaos. We need them. We need those people, the innovators, the mavericks, the lateral thinkers, to move the world forward and to solve problems. But we don't need too many of them because they will destabilize society. And so maybe it's kind of a feature, not a bug, of humanity that there's a massive people who are just susceptible to hypnosis because that's what's required to keep order in complex communities. Something like that.
I'm quite, in relatively recent times, I've been quite swayed by, or I find quite intoxicating the idea that we were told at university when it came to anthropology that we've always been the same. Human consciousness is human consciousness, and all that's ever separated us down through the millennia are our circumstances, whatever, our access to resources or the prevailing technology or whatever. But we've all essentially been the same thing. But much more recently, I've been swayed by the notion that human consciousness has been evolving along with everything else, and that some thousands of years ago we were more of just a bicameral mind, that we were making decisions without pondering them. I think you touched on this earlier. There are those that look at Homer's Iliad, and whenever it was written, several thousand years ago, and by whom. But there's a scene, for example, where one of the heroes is about to attack Agamemnon for stealing his woman or whatever. And it's a goddess, invisible, that grabs him by the hair and pulls him away, makes him not do that. He doesn't decide. He doesn't weigh it up and decide. A goddess just stops him and he doesn't do it. And that the audience that was written for got that. Oh yeah, that's how it is. I'm presented with a situation and there's just this kind of instant reaction. I'm not in control of it. It comes from outside. But in the millennia that come to us, we've now become very introspective, and we're not just bicameral. We've got this kind of separate third element that's weighing things up. Maybe the hypnotized people are more like that kind of, I don't know, that earlier bicameral, instantaneous goddess pulls you by the hair and makes you do something. You don't have to think about it.
Almost pre-consciousness,
Uh-huh.
And look, I mean, one of the reasons I hate business books so much. There's a particular strand in business books, the recapitulation of a CEO's life. So, Jack Welch, after 20 years at General Motors, or however long it was, comes and writes a just so story about how he made all these great decisions. I, Jack Welch, realized when I woke up one day that this is what we had to do for General Electric. They tell the story in those terms in a very linear fashion, so that they retell their life as if at this point I thought about it and I saw it clearly and I made this logical decision. That's not how the world works. That's not how corporations and institutions develop. Inside our minds, there's a proliferation of programs running. And the capacitor on that program gets amped up, and then this one is struggling to defeat it. And you have these intuitions, and you have reason, and you have desires, and this complex sort of convergence of multiple algorithms, if you like, running and bearing down on the decision you're about to make. And people love, after having made that decision, to try and tell that little just so story that says why I made the decision in a nice, neat little paragraph. But that's just a complete failure to represent the reality of decision-making processes. And so, for me, you can forget about actually trying to, the post hoc rationalization is impossible. And so the device that you insert there, Agamemnon being dragged back by the goddess Hera by the hair, that's almost as good an explanation for how Agamemnon made the decision as any kind of an analysis of his thought processes or his childhood is likely to deliver. So I kind of go with it.
For me, there's something very illustrative as well in that. I've said this before. I don't know if I've said this to you, Nick, but all of us have had an experience of being in company. You sat around a table or whatever, and the chat's going well, and there's wine and blah blah blah, and you say something, and the whole room just breaks up. Everyone, it's a great quip, and you like to think, as you say, maybe the next day you might rehearse how that came to you. Because I'm so smart, but in reality, we all have these moments where you don't compose the sentence at all. It's on your tongue and out before you're even aware of it. And it is really, and like you say, it's as though the truth. It's as though you have a moment as a lightning conductor, and the lightning's there, and it just comes through you, looking for Earth, and out it comes. And the truth is, you didn't compose that great line at all. It just used you to get out.
I completely agree with that, and I actually think it's generalizable. As in, like, you can it's, as an explanation for how things work. Creativity has this feature in general, all of the time, in all instances of creativity. There's this component of unforeseen, unretellable inspiration, the flash. I think it's present in all instantiations of creativity. And we do not know how to program it. That's why one of the reasons why I'm not afraid of AI. I don't think AI will ever come near having consciousness or the ability to be truly creative, to create new explanations for how the world works. I think that's it's partly because of the complexity of our thought processes, their irreducibility to nice little analyses, that we are unable to articulate or to program creativity into machines. That's a real hard feature of life, that inspiration comes from, and creativity and insight, novel explanations come from this spookily complex place.
I think we need maybe as well as being that. I think there is really a very liberating humility about that. Yeah. Rather than waste your time trying to reverse engineer your own cleverness, post hoc analyses. If you just open up to the fact that sometimes you just get lucky with a thought, You don't compose it. Your best. It's like when novelists talk about, books writing themselves. Or, I remember knowing that, like John Denver, Annie's song, he said he didn't compose that. It was just there. It was just like, and Paul McCartney does the same sort of shtick about whatever, Penny Lane or something. He just woke up and the whole thing was there. Melody, lyrics, the works. And I think in that, when you just say that, how did you come up with Penny Lane or whatever, or how did you compose such and such? There's a great liberating humility in just going, I've got not the first idea. It was there. And I'm sure people like Stephen King in his novels or whoever, if they were being honest with themselves, they would just go, I just kind of got handed it as a gift by a mysterious man in a black cloak. He just kind of gave me it, and there
I was visited by my spirit animal, Yeah, look, I mean, history is littered with these little stories. I love them. I sort of like collecting them in a way. The idea of Newton being hit on the head by an apple, discovering gravity sort of thing. And the idea of Archimedes stepping into a bath, Einstein imagining that he was on the end of a beam of light. There are just legions of these stories that accompany the sort of great intellectual discoveries. And I love to think about, what does it mean that those little stories exist, that there was this sort of serendipity to them. I think what the meaning is it's sort of the existence of those stories acknowledges this kind of beautiful serendipity is the right word. The kind of way in which almost out of a fog of confusion, suddenly light shines, illuminating the hitherto obscure. It's a beautiful kind of idea. It seems a little bit fatalistic. It just sort of say, well, and maybe a corollary of all of this is that we'll never get there. That the complexity is indeed irreducible.
But you're right. In my heart, I don't fear artificial intelligence either. I don't fear the possibility. It's that, we talked earlier about the Pacific Ocean of the human immune system. I pity almost, those that think, oh yeah, I've got a complete handle on human intelligence, and by the insertion of this circuit board, I can make that a lot better. I think, no, you can't. You no way are you clever enough to be able to get ahead of 7 million years of recent human evolution and however many billions of years, since we crept up onto the beach out of the primordial soup. You just can't. And I listen. I spent some time in Australia filming, and we spent some blessed time listening to some Aboriginal people, talking about the dreaming and so on, and you never hear it explained the same way twice, which is also good fun. But there's an insistence there that they only ever were in Australia. They didn't do the whole thing of like the out of Africa theory of, they don't buy that at all. We were always and only here, just in Australia.
Yeah.
And you go, and that kind of flies in the face of anthropological understanding, but who cares? Why that interests me, and because they have it, their cosmology has this dream time, this time before time.
Yeah.
I think what's possibly there is that that their ancestors did indeed come from somewhere else. And then eventually, through the long process, generation after generation, eventually found their way across a shallower sea into the north of Australia, and so on and so on. But I think there's a possibility that their ancestors did that pre-consciousness, hence the dreaming. Right. And that only when the many tens of thousands of years ago, when some of them were in Australia, they woke up to consciousness, or the beginnings of the consciousness that we understand. So in that sense, they have only ever been in Australia. They were only ever conscious in this way in Australia. And everything else was indeed the dreaming, which is the time before time. And every time I think about that, it puts the hairs up on the back of my neck. Because I think, at the very least, if you're contemplating Neuralinks and tweaking human intelligence, begin to contemplate the length of the journey that the animal has been on, not just physically, but cognitively. And to
Yeah.
think that you can come up with a circuit board that'll make all of that better or even replace it. I think,
Algorithm, yeah. Yeah.
no, you're not. You'll make something. You'll make something that's pretty impressive, but it won't be
Yeah,
that.
you'll automate something. You'll automate something that's well described. But yeah, I'm with you. I think that trying to emulate consciousness and creativity, I don't like to use the word impossible because, the existence of programs that do that is proven by the existence of humans, right? So in principle, you can write the code for that algorithm somewhere else. But I think that it's practically impossible. I don't think we'll ever see a day when we have in silico consciousness or creativity. I don't think it'll ever happen.
No, I mean the fine tuning of consciousness is really what gets to me. I think,
Yeah.
it's that when it comes to memory. I mean, obviously a lot of stuff to do with computerization is memory, and that we've got just enough memory. Well, our memory works in such a way that every morning when you're waking up, you remember who you are. To continue
Yeah.
being Nick Hudson or Neil Oliver.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's not too much that all you do is remember. It's like if you're reading a book, your concentration is tweaked to such a pitch that you can remain in the book for as long as you want to remain in the book. But at any given moment, you can distract yourself with something else. If your focus was any more, you'd never get off the book because it wouldn't let the other in. And it's all of it. It's like the whole Goldilocks thing about how close planet Earth is to the sun and whatever. Those conditions are just right, like the Goldilocks porridge. Everything about the tweaking, the fine tuning of our existence. You think how could you possibly think that you understood that enough to make it better? That's the bit.
Yeah, to improve on it. I know, and that's the arrogance at the heart. It's the same kind of arrogance behind the world's worst idea of utopian collectivism that we were talking about earlier. It's that sort of overweening arrogance that suggests that yes, that system, the billions of years of evolution behind the human brain is something that I, Nick Hudson, am going to just sit down, I'm going to bang out a paper, and I'm going to improve.
Do you think? I mean, I'm aware of the time, Nick. I'm grateful for the time of others. But just as a kind of a closing thought, I suppose I'd invite you to, is that what we're talking about there in the last 10 or 15 minutes? Are these the reasons to be cheerful? That whatever times we are living through, and whatever the objectives are of the cabal that may or may not exist, that the collective utopia will never work, and that it will always come back to people being humble enough to allow for the inspiration that comes from wherever, and the grassroots up and not centre down.
I believe in the sort of cyclicality of history, but I kind of see my cycles as being plotted on a graph of increasing trajectory. I'm not too sure what it exactly is that is increasing, but let's call it human flourishing. So I kind of have an optimism in that sense. As we accumulate knowledge, we organize a world that's better and better. I have that optimism, and inside those cycles of history, I think I also notice the propensity for things to change all of a sudden. Where something breaks down in a way that nobody predicted. And that's, again, in the nature of complex systems, when they crash, when they collapse, it's almost always, well, maybe always, never predicted. The things fly apart in a way that nobody foresaw. And I think this is the inevitable future of all would-be centralizing systems. These elaborate systems of control and articulation of technocracy are all destined to fail spectacularly. The question is when they will fail, and it's hard to predict. So I sort of live with this idea that, we sit here believing that we're fighting against thunder. But it could be that there's the tipping point surprises all of us, and that one day suddenly the idea that you battled to see projected or to be heard is suddenly prevalent. I think it can happen like that. That's my gut, my intuition. I can't write you a theorem for why that is the case, but it's also, I think, a good reason to keep on fighting.
I love it, Nick. I'm going to leave that there. I think that the ever-present promise of human flourishing, I think we'll leave it there. Nick Hudson, That was a conversation. That's exactly the conversation I hoped we would have. Thank you.
Real pleasure, Neil, and thank you again for your company. And I know that we've got many, many more interesting conversations ahead of us, and that's a great thing.
Oh, yes. We're always only paddling on the surface of that conversation.